This is a really funny topic, PCK, and so I'm going to tell you what's supposed to happen in the presentation just so that you can hang in with me, because it'll sort of make sense when I get to slide 157. So hang in for the first 156 and then you'll go, oh, that's what that hour and a half was all about, all right? It's a tough topic because PCK, Pedagogical Content Knowledge, is one of those things that's a really cool idea, but actually a hard thing to see, a hard thing to capture, a hard thing to demonstrate, and a hard thing to say, this is what a teacher does. So a way of trying to get into it, just think to yourself, what is your favourite lesson? I don't care what the subject is, just think of your favourite lesson and then think to yourself, why is it your favourite lesson? Why is an important question? And then if I was walking along the corridor and coming past that room, you know, what would that lesson look like? What do you know about the teaching and the learning of that lesson that is special? You're supposed to be getting all these in your head because there's a test coming up in 1 minute, all right? How did you learn that stuff about that special lesson? And then, and I hope this is something that you would jump to pretty easily, why do you value that lesson? Okay? Within those questions, as I slowly unpack all of this, is the essence of PCK. All right? So, as I go through the slides that I've got, try to hold these questions in your head. Try to hold the image of this favourite lesson. Particularly pay attention to what is special about it that makes it favourite. And that notion of valuing is a big deal. And I'll just tap into a couple of things Simon was saying at the start. And I hope the things I say here don't sound condescending, because I don't mean it that way. In teaching, we're so busy doing that we don't get a chance to step out for a little while and think about practice. And as a consequence, that notion of valuing our knowledge, skills and ability, I think, is way, way underestimated. Outside of teaching, what I'm doing now is seen as good teaching. Well, just teaching, standing and delivering. Sadly, sometimes even in teaching, we think this is what it's all about. But the essence of quality in teaching is that notion of pedagogy, that teaching should influence learning and learning should influence teaching. So it's in a relationship. One can't work without the other. And our difficulty is this becomes a pseudonym for practice or pedagogy, when in fact all this is delivery. And you might do it with, well, I was going to say good slides, but these are a little bit boring as you look at the screen, but with a sense of humour or acting. I mean, there are all sorts of things that we clothe delivery of information in, but it's still delivery of information. So when you start thinking about a favourite lesson, what does it look like? What is the teaching and learning? Why do you value it? What's special about it? It's actually asking questions that we don't usually have in our normal way of talking about teaching and learning and our practice. All right? And so PCK starts to open this world up a little bit. But let me take you backwards. I'll give you a little story. Lee Shulman, who came up with the language of PCK, he was the president of the American Education Research Association back in the early 80s when he was a relatively young man. He came from a psychology background and he was always interested in thinking and learning. And so he paid a lot of attention to it. At the time that his ideas of PCK started to bite, there was also an interesting political situation. And I think we're going through it now with NAPLAN and a bunch of other things. That is, that if you've got content knowledge, almost everything else is assumed to be okay because content reigns supreme. And I'm an old biology teacher, so I dig the idea that content matters. But in a political sense, when content is the only thing that matters, that's actually quite a challenge to what it means to be a skillful, artful, capable, quality teacher. Okay? So at the time when Shulman was playing with this, he was in an environment when teaching was being equated with having the content to deliver. And so that made a whole bunch of issues really clear. The idea of teaching as transmission reigned supreme. The idea that subject matter knowledge was all that mattered lifted that to the top and undermines the idea of the knowledge, skills and ability that a teacher might have. And then the thing that really irritated him was, in America, this idea of teacher certification. So at the time, he was in Washington, DC for some meeting, and he picked up the local newspaper. And teacher certification in those days, the teachers went and did a test, and you passed or you failed. And he picked up the newspaper, and there was this article in it from a reporter who basically said, there's not much associated with teaching. I don't even know why they need to go to university to get a qualification, because I sat the teacher certification test a week ago and with no training passed and am now able to be a qualified teacher. And so Shulman was outraged, one, at the pathetic nature of a test that would do that, but on the other, this reinforcing the idea in public that there's not much to teaching. So long as you had the knowledge of the content, the subject matter, that was the go. Okay? Says a lot about views of primary teachers, for example. So what he did, he started to think much more deeply about what he could see, what he researched, what he understood from his psychology background in terms of what teachers do. And so he started unpacking these ideas that actually PCK can throw open the complexity of teaching because it makes an argument about teaching being problematic as opposed to transmission of information. Now, problematic is not meant to carry negative connotations. It doesn't mean it's a bad problem. Problematic means it's something that's interesting, curious, engaging, inviting, something that causes you to stop and think again. Go back to your favourite lesson. How did you learn it? Sometimes you learn stuff about teaching because you hear or see or experience something new in the classroom that you didn't expect. And it causes you to stop and think and look again. And if it is genuinely problematic, you start working through ideas that are thrown up by the nature of the situation. Expert teachers do that because they've had years of experience that have helped them narrow the time it takes to recognise a problem, come up with an idea, test it out in their mind, put it to practice in the classroom and move on almost as if they're not thinking. And again, that's another reason why teachers often undervalue what they know and do. Because their routines are so developed, they don't recognise how smart they are in being to weigh up a situation and have options and respond appropriately. And so part of what PCK does is it really challenges the notion of transmission because it begins to cause, whether you like it or not, to begin to unpack the idea of teaching as something other than delivery of information. So what Shulman did then, he started to put the idea of PCK out in the world. And just as it, probably sounds vague and confusing at the moment, So it did at the time. Pedagogical, so something about teaching, but think about what I said earlier. Pedagogy is not a synonym for teaching. It's the teaching, learning, teaching relationship. Content, you think about the nature of subject matter knowledge and what it really contains. And then if you go into the depths of what philosophers will talk about with knowledge, it actually becomes quite a powerful construct, but a very difficult thing to see and explain. And so he started to then develop an agenda around PCK that caused other educational researchers to start exploring what was known as the knowledge base of teaching. So think about what it means. Think about your learning to teach. You have to have knowledge of the curriculum. You have to have knowledge of student learning. You have to have knowledge of teaching. You have to have knowledge of the context. Think about all these things as not just stuff that you experience along the way, but ideas, information, knowledge that you develop over time that allows you to function. Remember what it was like to be a first year teacher or a student teacher, and then think about what you were like 10 years later. What worried you then because you didn't have this huge umbrella full of links to things was so challenging. But as you develop that knowledge over time, these things come together and you have a framework in which to function and operate, even if you can't describe it. So here's one of the problems with being at university. The ivory tower is fantastic at having abstract ideas that researchers love, but serves no purpose in a practical sense in the world in which their ideas ought to apply. So, apart from my mum, you know, not many people read the things I write. Shulman a little bit better than me. I think his mum and his dad read his stuff. But in essence, he had this idea of PCK that a lot of researchers found really seductive because it did two things. It said there's a specialist knowledge and skill that's caught up in this idea, and if there's a specialist knowledge and skill, then that means teaching comprises much more than many people ever imagine. Therefore, it should be more highly valued. Now, for me, that's tick, tick, tick. They are great statements to make. They are difficult things to share, to demonstrate, and to make known and understandable. But that's what Shulman did through the notion of PCK. And so, from his perspective, it sounded really good in theory. It does sound really good in theory. What does it look like in practice? What does it really mean? That's where it gets tough. And so when Simon said, could I come and do this today? I go, I can do really cool stuff that nobody understands, but you probably want something that makes sense. Can't you get somebody else? And that's what PCK is like. And even now, you know, just looking at the looks on your faces, and I'm trying not to get eye contact, promise. You know, hopefully you're sort of going with me, believe me, it'll come, it'll make sense. But that's what PCK is like. Now, most teachers wouldn't have made it this far through the overheads, because what does a teacher want? I want something that works in class tomorrow. That's not a criticism. That's the reality of classroom practice. We may sometimes argue about students needing to be engaged and thinking deeply and all that. Those things get misconstrued sometimes as keeping the kids busy and having fun. PCK is not busy and fun. PCK is deep engagement in learning, because as a teacher, you're making the amalgam between your pedagogical knowledge, your subject, your curriculum knowledge, the context in which you work, the nature of the kids you're teaching, and how those things combine for you to structure your teaching in a particular way, with that particular content, with a particular group of students, for a particular learning outcome. Sounds easy, but it's far from it. Hence, sounds good in theory. What does it really look like in practice is a huge dilemma and really difficult to make sense of. Okay? So keep hanging in, all right? I'll go through some of the issues. Sometimes we can look at really good teaching activities and know that they contribute to PCK, but on their own, they're not PCK. And again, I'll keep saying what it's like in the classroom, and not as a criticism at all, just trying to keep rooted in reality. As a classroom teacher, I need good activities. Okay? I need good activities. There's a huge difference between having a good activity and knowing why it's a good activity and why I would use it, or why I might not, or how I might need to adjust it. And really good teachers, you know it, you see it all the time, you probably do it yourself. Really good teachers can take an idea and adjust it, manipulate it, play with it to make it work in their classroom. And really good teachers know that what works in one classroom may not work in the other, but they know the gem of the idea they're playing with, and so they can adjust. Those things are the beginning of this idea of understanding an activity as a bit of an insight to PCK, but not being PCK. But it's a way of starting to peel back the layers and make sense of it. Sometimes, and this is really hard, PCK can become evident over time. Teaching a unit of work, the knowledge that a teacher has of teaching that particular subject in that particular way at that time with those students is built into the way the unit is developed, so that understanding is unfolding over time, not blocks just being lined up together to make some joined up structure. The unfolding of understanding over time within the content is an illustration of what PCK can be. Now this is the hardest thing, and interesting that Simon used that thing from Michelangelo about the sculpture is in the rock. Well, nothing is more recognisable with us as teachers than we know sort of what we're doing, but we find it very hard to talk about it because that knowledge is tacit. My wife is a primary school teacher, apart from all the other things that she says, you know, so you're a Dean of Education, can't you give me anything that's helpful in my class? But every now and again, of course, I ask her questions about what's going on. So one time when some math stuff she was doing was going on, I said to her, well, if you're having these problems, what do you do about it? She goes, oh, don't do that to me again. I just know this kid will get it now, this kid will get it tomorrow, and this kid won't get it for another month or so. I've got to manage that, and I will recognise when it works. But just going over it 100 times with this kid is not going to make it happen, even though the first kid's got it immediately. And I go, well, what are the things you're looking for? What are those clues? Oh, I don't know, but I just know when it happens. That's tacit knowledge. If you can spend time with teachers unpacking their tacit knowledge, you can hear a whole lot about what they know and how they function and why they do things. But it's not generally part of our language, it's not part of our culture. We whip into the staff room at recess or lunchtime, had this really cool lesson, I did a concept map, good, I can use that next time. Had a really cool role play, the kids, oh, role play, right. But we don't ever say, so why did it work? What was the type of learning that you saw? How come you think that made a difference? Why would you have used that in that lesson or with that content, but not in this lesson? Those are the types of questions that start to get at the tacit knowledge that teachers carry. Because the whole idea of PCK then is that tacit knowledge within a subject area, it becomes even more difficult. And the other problem, and again, I was exactly the same as this as a classroom teacher, pedagogical content knowledge, I would have lost interest at ped, you know. I would never have got to pedagogical, much less content and knowledge. Again, it's not a criticism, it's just the nature of our work. We're so busy, we're rushing so much and we're trying to get things done and deal with situations that these things seem like jargon and they just get in the way. Unfortunately, and we should spend more time on this with our colleagues, jargon is really important because it's shorthand for a whole bunch of stuff that we shouldn't have to explain every time we come across it. So language of teaching and learning is actually really important for sharing knowledge. Pedagogical content knowledge shouldn't be a barrier to thinking about what it is we know and are able to do within a subject field. It should be a window into something valuable, able to be shared, and demonstrate what our knowledge, skills and ability are and why they matter. When you play through all of this then, you have two really important things that I think matter for PCK. The first one is it's coming to understand the content differently through teaching it. Through teaching it. Try and remember the first time you taught a topic you'd never taught before. You sort of learn it better when you're going to teach it for the first time than you ever thought before, because you do something that's really important. You start asking all the questions about the things you don't understand. And you're not embarrassed that some of those questions may seem foolish because you're trying to make sense of the content. And as you make sense of it, you start to think about, well, what would that mean for how I would teach it so that these issues are not a concern for the students? And you're starting to get around the edges of PCK. Again, over time, as these things accumulate, it's very hard to remember a particular event or a thing that caused it because it's largely about an accumulation over time. And so reconstructing how we develop our knowledge, skills and ability over time can be quite difficult. You have some epiphanous moments, but largely it's an accumulation over time without a great deal of considered reflection because we're rushing on all of the time. So I'm nearly getting to the point that you'll go, oh, I think I know what he's talking about now. All these things are about the environment, the issues, the background, the history that shape why I think PCK matters. When teaching becomes routinised, then quality teaching can be diminished. Okay? When I'm initially trying to work out how to teach something, I'm unpacking pieces all the way along. And I'm experimenting and testing and trying to find out what works and what doesn't work. And I'm also actually testing the boundaries of my own understanding of things. But over time, those things become clearer, stronger, more ingrained, and it feels like a routine rather than a well-organised, thoughtful unlaying of practice. And then the difficulty is, as these things do become more ingrained and routinised, it can smother the idea of the quality that's required for that practice to happen. Okay? So let me give you an example. And I can remember this, really clearly. I'd been teaching at CBC Year 9. I taught all of Year 9 and all of Year 10 geography for about 4 or 5 years. Had its advantages and had its disadvantages. The advantage was when I taught the first lesson, I had 3 more chances. But you can imagine what marking was like. It also meant that if I didn't get a topic, and there was lots of that, I was always being confronted by the things that didn't seem to make sense. I couldn't gloss over it and let it go because I only did it once. But after a while, you sort of get into the routine and things are going, and I thought I was doing all right as a teacher. And then I got asked one year, could I teach Year 11 and 12 biology? And I'd been Year 9 and 10, middle school teacher and all of that, and I thought, oh, this could be all right. One of the first topics I had to teach in biology was taxonomy. I don't know if you ever went through this in school yourself, but as a teacher then, you know, the idea of a dichotomous key. And I can remember thinking to myself, this shouldn't be too hard. And the idea of teaching taxonomy that my colleague, who was very experienced at biology, took a month to teach, took me 3 lessons. Because I just powered through the content. The first time I taught it, I thought I did a really good job, and the kids were bored and didn't learn anything, and it was awful for them, but it was great for me because I got all the content delivered. The second time I taught it, something clicked in my mind and I paid attention to them, not me. And I realised this dichotomous key stuff is much more complex than it appears. And so in the first instance, when I had taught it and just gone through the idea and drawn a map on the board of a dichotomous key and said, learn how to do that, get it done, I'll set you a few homework questions, all solved. The next time I taught it, I started thinking about how do you do that in a class? So CBC was a great school. They all had to wear their blazer. If you didn't wear your blazer, you were in for a detention. The first thing that occurred to me was I could differentiate in the class by the boys using a dichotomous key. So stand up if you're not wearing your blazer. It took a little while because the kids thought they were in trouble. But it separated the audience off into 2 groups, with and without the blazer. The kids who had their blazer on, doing the right thing, as always was the case for most of them in school, they was winter supposed to have their jumper on as well. Who's wearing a jumper and who's not under their blazer? Dichotomous key cuts it off again. We could work our way through the whole school uniform to separate the kids off with a yes, no at every stage, which is a dichotomous key, and arrive at the person. Oh, I thought this was so good. I'd finally discovered something, you know. I'm not sure what my colleague, who took a month to teach his stuff, must have thought about what I was doing. But I was learning as I started to try and make sense of the content. Eventually I ended up with a thing with, you know, envelopes and animals in it, and they had to pull the animal out and be able to tell me how it went from kingdom to species to phylum to subphylum. Because eventually, after, God knows, maybe 5 years, I actually was able to relate it to what they were supposed to do in biology, and they sort of got it. But it took me a long time to understand it, because initially I thought it was just simple, tell them what to do, follow the algorithm. And eventually I was teaching them, and hopefully they were learning, but I'm not sure that I was all that good at determining that part of it. So becoming routinized, if I hadn't had that powerful experience, I might have ended up at the end point and just gone, that's what I do. And it just came together like that. And now things, and you forget all of the learnings that shaped the nature of the practice in the end, and then it just becomes part of the routine, and you don't recognize the power or the quality within it. So now this is what I've been sort of batting on about then. PCK becomes important or special because it's about that teaching with the particular content. So the PCK then is about choosing a particular teaching procedure for a particular pedagogical reason linked to a particular content or concept. Okay? So again, and I'm sorry science is my example all the time because that's what I taught. A good example, have you ever done, primary teachers do this a lot, teach day and night and phases of the moon. I started teaching science method, you know, in the dip ed. And I was able to encourage my students to do lots of things that I never did as a teacher. But I told them they ought to. Or I encouraged them to, let me put it that way. One of the most powerful lessons I ever had was I was working on a research project one time where we were interviewing lots of really good teachers, and they were talking about their activities, the ideas they had, and one of them was this role play of phases of the moon, okay? And I understood it, you know, in my head, And so I thought, oh, I'll do the role play. How hard can that be? And it was a really powerful learning experience. You know the idea that the moon, we only ever see one side of it, dark side of the moon, you know, not Pink Floyd, but the moon, right? There's this really interesting thing, and I've got to get the language right here, that in one revolution of the Earth, the moon rotates once on its axis. Now, I don't know about you, but in my head, that is too abstract. It is too difficult for me to hold to understand that the moon actually rotates once on its axis while revolving around the Earth in a month, and yet you only ever see the same face. So if it rotates on its axis once, how can it possibly be that we only ever see the one face? So this really cool role play, you know, you get a bunch of the students together and link arms and become the Earth. And you can do all sorts of things that make this chaotic. And then you get about 3 of them to link arms like this and to be the moon. And you say to the moon, so John, you're the face of the moon. You have to watch the Earth all the time and do one full revolution. And as that happens, the face is the only thing looking at the Earth all the way around. And thank goodness I had a huge class in DipEd the year I did this, and I couldn't see over some of the people in front of me, so I stood on one of the benches outside. We did it outside. I was actually watching it sort of in plan view, and for the first time the idea made sense because it went from being abstract to concrete. And I could see the one face of the moon always looking at the Earth. And yes, it definitely rotated once on its axis. And all of a sudden I went, gosh, this is how it works. That's an activity that gives an insight into PCK. Using a particular teaching procedure, using that role play with that content for that reason, to challenge the abstract to become concrete, is an insight into PCK. Okay? It's a powerful way of beginning to understand that something has a reason for the way you use it with that content. It's not just saying, do a role play, they're good fun. It's saying, with this content, that role play helps to make the abstract concrete and demonstrates clearly something that most students find very difficult to understand and visualise, and that some teachers find very difficult to visualise, and yet we teach it. Okay? And then finally, this notion that the knowledge of practice is developed by seeing into teaching with new eyes and then articulating those insights, both for oneself and for others, is when PCK starts to be really valuable, because now it's being put out there. So as a teacher educator, I want my student teachers not to be saying, John, what's a good activity you've got, like a role play. I want to be saying, why is that a good activity? Why would you use it? How does it fit with this content, and where might it actually fit into the unit of work? And then you're getting at PCK. You're not just encouraging the development of a bag of tricks, you're actually saying there is a knowledge underpinning this, that if you pay attention to it, if you develop it, if you work with it, you've got more likelihood of enhancing your students' learning. That is so different from delivering a bunch of information. And so PCK becomes this powerful way of beginning to capture that knowledge, those skills, that ability, and to do it for yourself first of all, but then in the nature of sharing, demonstrating how different it is to just a bunch of activities that work. Okay? So in essence, PCK can be both a process, learning about these things, and a product, what you see in that knowledge. Both a process and a product. And that captures the essence of the dynamic, complex, sophisticated nature of teaching. When we're product driven, we tend to revert to the transmission of information. When we're process driven, sometimes we forget about the importance of whatever the content, the subject matter knowledge is. So thinking about PCK as both a process and a product does this other really important thing. It brings those two sometimes competing or even contradictory positions together, and there's an insight again, not just into PCK, but into quality in teaching and learning. So go back to my role play. You could be watching two teachers doing that role play, and one of them gives the explanation that I gave, and so that role play is being used and it's pedagogical content knowledge. And another teacher is doing exactly the same role play, and when you talk to them about it, they say, it's just such a fun activity. The kids just love it. World of difference. The same thing, one embedded in PCK and therefore enhancing student learning, and the other one, let's hope there's student learning. But you know what? Really, it's filling up some time, it's a good fun activity, and it's probably breaking the normal routine. And by breaking the normal routine, then this is a good thing because the kids are not quite so bored. I'm guilty of that. You know, again, it's not a criticism, we all do it. This side is when the PCK is for real. This side is what, unfortunately, I think we too easily encourage by not having a focus on quality and by not valuing the knowledge, skills and ability that we have as professionals. This one's a little bit confusing. Pedagogical content knowledge, you know, the amalgam of pedagogy and content, blah, blah, blah. Julie Guest-Newsome, a big-time educational researcher, tried to unpack the difference between like an activity that works and then PCK. And she said that the idea of PCK can be interpreted as integration, i.e. I get a bunch of things and I put them together, and now I've got a unit of work or ways of thinking about things, and I've integrated some ideas into my practice. And that's how some people might see PCK. The alternative to that is that you actually transform learning of content. And that's different from lining up a bunch of things that are important. It's actually going to the heart of the content needs to become something new for the students. And in the first instance, you think back, it's when it became new for you. And so trying to build that sense of curiosity, that engagement, that need to know is one of the drivers of PCK. Articulating it is the big deal in making it be useful, you know, in a sort of community sense of what the profession could do with. So in lots of ways, you have this thing then that you could misinterpret PCK as just putting the right activities together into a unit of work, and you could say, I've got PCK. What Julie Guest-Newsome argued, and which I like, is the idea that it's got to be something more than that. It's got to be that it's transformed. And through transformation, you're asking something really special, that the teacher is the conduit for that. In some way, the thinking about the practice and the way it's done is a conduit for transforming understanding. And the last thing there, you think teachers' collective wisdom, it illustrates the variation in PCK, because there's not one PCK for a topic. So again, another thing that highlighted for me how this stands out. For a long time, I used to have really, one of the best things about going to uni is you get opportunities to go to lots of places. And at one stage I was working with Trinity Grammar over in Kew. And the science faculty there were very keen to talk about their practice. And so I had the privilege of being able to sit in classes and then talk with teachers afterwards. And I saw two really, really good physics teachers teaching exactly the same thing in really different ways. And I saw them teaching exactly the same thing sometimes in exactly the same way. And so one of the things that stood out for me about this variation is that sometimes how a teacher themselves conceptualises the field or the unit or the theme dramatically influences what they do about it. Sometimes those conceptualisations are common for some themes, and sometimes they're quite different. It's not about being right or wrong, it's about this variation. So, electricity, that's a pretty cool topic to teach, you know. How the heck does an electric current or whatever makes lights work, how does it know when to let whatever makes the lights go on go? How does it know that it's been turned on or off at a switch? Good science teachers have got analogies and metaphors and ways of explaining stuff that on the surface is really hard to understand. But they also know when they start to break down and when to let them go. So often in electricity, people use the example of a hose with the water moving around it. The idea that electricity is like a current works okay with the hose analogy for a while. Then it starts to break down. As teachers begin to understand their content, so their PCK can be developed, but they don't often talk about it, they just grab the activity. Again, I'm arguing we don't want to think about PCK as getting the right PCK or being able to fill up a book with the only PCK on this topic. It's about understanding it as a concept that dramatically influences the way we can see the sophistication of our teaching in a subject area, and therefore hopefully more highly value it. For ourselves first of all, but within the profession more generally, and in the outside world, that would be so cool. So again, as a academic, you know, I always want to apologise for being at uni. But let's just, anyway, as a happy academic, when we first started playing with the idea of PCK, I used to be quite critical of my older colleagues, and now I'm one of those older colleagues. I go, you know, it would be really good if something we did actually helped a teacher. And so when we started playing with PCK, we were really keen for what we did to actually be useful in a classroom. It's a pretty challenging idea sometimes in academia, but it actually really matters. And so we said we really love the idea of PCK as academics, but what would it really, really look like? How could you really, really use it? Why does it really, really matter? And so we did a study, and I'll show you how long it takes for things to make sense. We first did this research paper that came out in 2004. By the time our second version of a book on this came out in 2012, we reckon we understood what we were doing. So in actually trying to make PCK meaningful, useful, applicable or whatever in teachers' work, we had a huge learning task ourselves. But I think this idea that we came up with around cores and papers is a way of making it concrete. So I'll test it with you. So to make it into a concrete example, and here's a few of those little tricks that you inevitably do in academia so that your name goes against it. But then the content, it wasn't good enough to call in pedagogical content knowledge, the content is the content. We actually reckoned that the content was represented. And so that's what CORE was short for, content representation. Somehow a teacher represents the content, they don't just regurgitate it. Okay? Living in that world that I'm saying about this is sophisticated, dynamic, complex business, not just transmission of information. This one's a little bit tougher. The pedagogy is made up of what we were saying was the pedagogical and professional experience repertoires, hence PaP-eRs. So I always wanted these things that demonstrated how teachers work to be under the name of PaP-eRs, so we just worked for a long time to get some good words that went together and made it into PaP-eRs. It's funny when you go to conferences and that people are talking about your work and they think this is French or something, the PaP-eRs, you know. and I'm a Footscray boy, you know, they were just bloody PaP-eRs, you know. So it actually becomes really interesting. But in essence, the notion of core and PaP-eRs was to say, how do you represent the content? And then how do you demonstrate how that content plays out in practice in different ways? And you had to have cool little names, whether you think they're cool or not. Let's not go into a debate about it. But that whole thing is just that academic thing, you know. So core and PaP-eRs, anywhere in the world you go, they'll say, oh, that's that stuff from Monash. So putting them together then becomes in a subject field or under a theme what we called a folio, a resource folio, because you have a core, which I'll show you in a second, and then the PaP-eRs that surrounded it, and it's sort of like a resource. Not a resource in as much as saying, use this and you'll have your unit of work, but rather going the other way and saying, in looking at this, you can see what PCK looks like in this unit of work. So, there are things we know that are difficult to teach. So
In a typical study, students accessed a website where they took a multiple choice pre-test. The questions were something like, consider a basketball player shooting from the free throw line. After the ball leaves his hand...
Can you hear that back there? It's only coming out of my computer, not the...
and constant. B, upwards and decreasing. C, downwards and constant. D, downwards and decreasing. Or E, tangent to the path of the ball. After the pretest, students were randomly assigned to see one of several online videos. The videos contained correct answers to many of the pretest questions. For example, here's a clip.
Now we'll consider a case where gravitational force is the only force acting on an object. While a juggling ball is in the air, we'll ignore air resistance because it's so small. Only one force acts on the ball throughout its flight. This is the force of gravity, which is constant and downwards. Gravity accelerates the ball in the downwards direction. After being thrown up, a ball travels slower and slower upwards. Its velocity goes through zero, and then it speeds up in the downward direction. The whole time the ball is accelerating downwards. Then it meets the juggler's hand.
Immediately after watching the roughly 10-minute video, the students took exactly the same test. I also interviewed some students to see what they thought of the video. The most common comments were that it was clear, concise, and easy to understand. The students also increased their confidence in the correctness of their answers compared to the pretest. So what about how much they learned? On the pretest, the average score was 6.0 out of 26, and after the video, the average was 6.3. Well, what was going on? I dug deep in interviews to find out. It turned out students did not even correctly remember what was presented in the video that they had seen a few minutes earlier. One recalled, in the video it said the ball is slowly decreasing in force, so therefore it stops at one point and then comes down. What was worse, another told me it wasn't that hard to pay attention to because I knew already what she was talking about. I hadn't told them about this 6 out of 26 yet. So I was listening, but I wasn't really paying utmost attention. Typically we think of education as informing students about things they are not aware of, like the French Revolution, for example. But science presents a different challenge. It is not that students know nothing about it, but that they already have plenty of ideas, most of which are, unfortunately, wrong, scientifically speaking. They don't pay attention because they think they know it, and then when asked what they saw, they falsely remember their own ideas as what was presented. Is there a way to overcome this? Well, I thought students might pay more attention and be able to understand if their ideas were presented in the video. So one of the other videos involved an actor pretending to be a student with the most common misconceptions, which were illustrated.
Can you tell me what happens when a single ball goes around once?
Well, Luke's hand gives the ball a force that drives it upwards against gravity. But as it goes up, this force gradually dies away until at the very top it perfectly balances gravity. And then gravity wins and the ball falls down.
He then discussed with the other dialogue participant why the misconception didn't work and how the scientific idea differed. In interviews with students who watched this video, no one used the words clear, concise, or easy to understand. Most often, they said it was confusing. But on the post-test, the average score nearly doubled to 11 out of 26. When asked to rate how much mental effort they invested in watching the videos, students who saw the dialogue with misconceptions averaged a whole point higher than those who saw the explanation without misconceptions. And it seems like it worked. That increased mental effort translated into more learning.
True or false? Humans lived at the same time as dinosaurs.
I'll say true.
We really have to tackle these misconceptions somehow. It seems if you just present the correct information, 5 things happen. Number 1, students think they know it. 2, they don't pay their utmost attention. 3, they don't recognize that what is presented is different to what they're already thinking. And 4, they don't learn a thing. And finally, 5, perhaps most troublingly, they get more confident in the ideas they were thinking before. And this is a vicious cycle that we have to find a way to break in order to have effective science education.
So you think about that. A teacher that understands those things will teach the topic dramatically different from one who doesn't. There wouldn't be a teacher that you would bump into who would disagree with the idea that telling students information more loudly or more often makes them learn it or understand it. But when you watch their practice, they can often be demonstrating that that's what they think. And so the PCK, I disagree with a couple of things he says here. French Revolution, kids have got ideas about the French Revolution. Science is not that special. You mentioned the French Revolution, I think of knitting. So, off with the head, I think of the guillotine, of course. And nearly every topic we do, kids have got ideas about. It'd be an interesting topic that they come up with a complete blank slate. So you start to think about what it is that we know about learning content that should influence that content. That's an example of where deep dive into the learning of that content demonstrates that it is really hard to understand. Again, as a biology teacher, not a physics teacher, that thing about force is confusing. The explanation in that second video that the student said is actually the strongest misconception and probably carried by about 85% of the population, including all those biology teachers like me. Because it's how you think it works. I haven't applied a force, I throw the ball up and the force of throwing it up slowly gets beaten by the sense of gravity which then brings it back down. That seems to adequately explain the situation, but scientifically it's wrong. So again, when you know your content, you start to think about the teaching as something very different. That's getting at that aspect of a content representation. But look in that 3.5-minute video, the amount of information, ideas, and necessary confusion that's associated with representing the content. So the point of a core of a content representation is that it's not meant to be static. It's not meant to be the only, the best, the one way of representing the content. It's meant to show one way of representing the content. And the more sophisticated your understanding of the content, the more likely you have of alternative ways of representing it. The point of the core then for teachers is about, it actually helps to codify teachers' knowledge, because it's actually saying what it is that you know about it that should shape the nature of the learning, rather than just what is the content. The next thing about this then is trying to understand, you know, the issue of why a core sort of resonates with teachers, and it's got two bits. The first one is, and we do it as a bit of a matrix, we think about a topic or a theme or a unit of work. Those words are not very good actually. Probably a theme is best. So if you were teaching, let's stick with force. You're teaching force, there's a topic. And the first thing we ask teachers to do, which is really challenging, is to think of the big ideas for that topic. Not the chapter headings, not the pieces of information, but the big ideas. That is really, really hard to do, because it's thinking about the content now conceptually, not factually. We don't do that very much. And then the second bit about it is that we have these prompts down the left-hand side of what we call a core, and they're the powerful questions that unpack the big ideas. So I know this is hard to read and I'll go through it really quickly, but here's one for the circulatory system. So across the top we have big ideas. So let me show you what a big idea looks like. It's useful to explain the circulatory system using the model of a continuous closed system. That's a big idea. You won't see that as a chapter heading. The circulatory system functions to service the needs of individual cells. That is a big idea. Body systems are very dependent on each other for their proper functioning. Blood is a complex substance. These are not pieces of information, they're conceptual understandings of a topic. And to get these, when we've done this over time with teachers, it is really, really hard to do on your own. You need 3 or 4 teachers sitting around talking about the same topic to be able to do it, because you actually have to start testing whether it's a big idea or just a heading out of the chapter. It's very hard. And then it all starts, if you can do that, and I am saying it's difficult, if you can do that, then we have these prompts that slowly unpack it. These prompts come from talking to fantastic teachers and getting the tacit knowledge of the things they ask of their practice. So what you intend the students to learn about this idea. So let me jump across here. The big idea, blood is complex substance. Blood is composed of cells, cell fragments, liquid plasma and dissolved substances. Okay? That's what you intend the students to learn. Why is it important for students to know this? So you have a look. Look, the circulatory system functions to service the needs of individual cells because cell life and death affects the whole organism. You see how a big idea drives why these things matter. What else do you know about this idea? Think about that video I just showed you. What do you know about this idea that you don't intend the students to know at this stage? And going back to that question about the primary teachers, they are withholding ideas quite a lot for very good reasons, because they don't want the students to be turned off by something that's way too complex or difficult or boring in advance. The difference to that is the idea that people dumb down content. That's two different things. Not letting all of your information drive a lesson is different to saying I need to make this as simple as possible, because there's a pedagogic reason underpinning it. So have a look at this one. The circulatory system is a continuous closed model. Details of the circulatory system of other kinds in living things, insects, plants, they all have a form of circulatory system. When you understand it as a closed system, it services an organism. Big ideas, interesting prompts. So it goes on. Difficulties and limitations, that video I showed you made very clear difficulties and limitations with force. Knowledge about students' thinking, which influences your teaching of this idea. Okay? If I go back to that force one, a science teacher who understands that kids cannot grasp that idea because their misconception is so strongly held, will approach the topic incredibly different from someone who goes, I can just tell them the right answer and it'll fix it. So the knowledge of students' thinking that influences, it's very hard to dispel an alternative conception. And just telling you the right answer might mean you get it right on the test, but as soon as you walk out the room, you go on with the previous ideas that you had. We all do it. Other factors that influence your idea in this teaching. So this one here, students enjoy learning about themselves. Actually, that's a powerful piece of information that can dramatically change the way you deal with, particularly in biology, topics like this. Something about self and seeing yourself in what's being studied can be very powerful. And then finally, teachers will fill this box really quickly, teaching procedures, because they've got lots of activities. The point of it though is this part, the particular reason for using it to engage students. That's challenging. That's challenging. And then finally, I'll say this, but I don't quite mean it. This is sort of the assessment question, but not really. Specific ways of ascertaining students' understanding and or the confusion around the topic. Okay? So that's what a core looks like. And it comes, you know, when we work with teachers on this, we do it on two A4s together. What's that? A3, an A3 sheet and a blank thing. We don't expect there to be hundreds of big ideas. If there are too many big ideas, it's probably not a good topic or theme. It's probably too big a topic. You know, 4, 5, maybe 6 big ideas make up a good topic in teaching. Not every box has to be filled in. It's not saying you need to be able to fill all of this in. It's actually trying to say this is a way of you beginning to think about what it is you know and understand and what you might want to know more about or learn about. Those prompts are incredible drivers of teacher interest in what they're doing, because most good teachers are asking those questions in some way of what they're teaching, but they're not used to spitting it out of their mouth. They're not used to talking about those things together, but they are powerful ideas that drive a content representation. Then finally, this idea then of the papers that go around it. See how this goes.
This is a biological stain, all right?
Okay.
So if by accident, this
Accidentally.
so sorry.
Accidentally.
See accidentally.
Oh.
See accidentally how it's just a little bit over
Oh my
here.
God.
See how it's changing color? Oh, now here's the problem.
That's why I got to wear the
going
lab
back.
coat.
Look, if you look very carefully, blow on that. Go ahead and blow. It's turning back colorless because there's an acid in the air
Oh,
called
look at
carbon
that.
dioxide. So carbon dioxide will do that. So here, I just want.
Oh, gosh.
Okay.
Oh.
Now there are like common household things like
Oh, my
this. This is like a little fire extinguisher. Is that good? See? I think it's completely gone now. What do you think, Madam?
Oh, it feels like it to me.
See? So if you ever have
Oh, damn,
carbon
Dr. Shulman,
dioxide,
don't worry
this is
about that.
absolutely perfect. Is that great? How about the two maybe like, right?
Oh, great.
Kids, don't try this at home. Not at a friend's home. Just leave it to your teacher. Your kid will do just fine. Right? Don't try this at home. Right?
So think about the idea of a paper then, and go back to that thing I said about the difference between an activity and pedagogical reasoning that underpins it. That would be cool. Imagine doing that in class with the kids. They would love it. Would they learn anything? Sometimes you have to think carefully about the nature of the activity or how you help students focus on what they're to pay attention to. The lady in that, she didn't learn a thing of science. She's more worried about her hair and what was going on. Understandably, have you ever been blasted by a fire extinguisher? I tell you what, it wasn't a foam one, thank goodness. But a real pedagogical content knowledge action would not use that without helping the students focus on what the point is of the activity, what it is they're trying to learn and understand as a consequence. Do they even know that that fire extinguisher contained carbon dioxide? Do they know what carbon dioxide means for the chemical reaction of helping that ink disappear? Was it a fun activity? Did it catch their... You betcha. Did they learn anything? Not sure. Okay. Now the idea of papers then is that the papers sit around the outside of a core, if you can visualise it in that way. You got this core, this matrix with the big ideas and the prompts and all these little squares all filled in. Well, a paper is about an example of any of those squares in what it might look like in a teacher's practice. So that activity that was conducted there might be an example of something that was bringing out an understanding from the core. And it could be written up, it could be a video like that, but it's ways of trying to say, here is the skillful practice that turns this content representation into reality in the classroom. And there are lots and lots of ways of thinking about papers. The point of them is to try and illustrate what that content representation might look like when it's converted into practice. And sometimes that's about an activity in the class with reasoning. Sometimes it might be about student thinking. That previous video actually would make a very good paper. Sometimes it might be about what is the scribble that we do as teachers over the curriculum, the issues, the ideas, the problems that we have to play with. It's trying to capture the essence of the pedagogical knowledge tied to that content that makes it real, live, meaningful in practice. And so together then, the core and the papers form this resource folio, not as something to carry and copy, but as something to prompt the thinking about PCK and why it's special and why it should be highly valued. And so when you start looking at it this way, as a research project, it was trying to make PCK concrete. Now, inevitably, what happens with these sorts of things is what we intended to do and what happens are two different worlds. Most teachers couldn't care less about trying to write a paper or develop it, and I fully understand why. We were doing it to represent it back to them, not to ask them to do it. But they grabbed cores and they ran with them like you wouldn't believe, because it became a really, really powerful planning tool. Not a teaching tool, not saying this is what a unit ought to look like, but a planning tool. Geez, I've never thought about big ideas as a way of organising the content before. Oh, I think I know why I want them to learn this, but I didn't realise what difficulties they had with it. All of a sudden, the talk, the planning, the thinking, the articulation of knowledge of practice takes a completely different meaning. I'm not up to page 5, I'm up to the second big idea. I'm trying to ascertain student understanding. I'm not trying to test if they learnt the bit of information off by heart. There may be times the bit of information off by heart really matters, but it's not limited to that. So PCK then, is our knowledge of practice. And being able to think about it through the idea of cores and papers sort of makes it able to be shared. Not to say this is the only, the right, the correct PCK. It's an example to illustrate what it might look like, what it might mean. It offers a way of looking seriously into quality of teaching and learning. A teacher who can talk about their practice in these sorts of ways, they know what they're doing. Boy, they know what they're doing. And pedagogical reasoning is a key to making sense and moving beyond activities that work. The core and PaP-eRs then sort of captures this vague, abstract, difficult to understand idea and make it concrete. In making it concrete, maybe it makes it usable for teachers. They certainly like the core, they can use it, make sense of it, they're happy to read the papers and look at them but don't want to do them. I understand it. We were trying to capture pedagogical content knowledge, portray it in a way that made sense, and hopefully had teachers go, I have specialist skills, knowledge and ability that make what I do really important. Not any old jack can come in and do this. Not I'm a born teacher so I'm fine and I mastered it in my second round in my dip ed and haven't had to do anything since. The idea is knowledge development in any field is about going beyond the technical, beyond the base of the information and developing deeper and deeper understandings. In teaching, those deeper understandings about the nature of our practice and what we teach. What we teach. When you have to teach something you don't understand, you know how good a teacher you are in your other areas. And so you think about us as teachers. If we can't have a language that allows us to talk about, share and value what we know, are able to do and understand, we are lacking a lot. So we shouldn't be worried about PCK as jargon. Actually, we should be embracing it as a way of saying, see what we do, see what we know, see how we develop, see why just any old jack can't walk in off the street and say, I'll now be a physics teacher. Any old jack can come in and deliver content. They can stay a page in front of the kids, but it bears very little resemblance to a knowledge base, to a skill, to an ability that's designed to enhance student learning. PCK is a window to that world. It matters and it's something that I think we should be able to do more with. And in teaching, we've got so many things to do that we need to do some things that allow us to say, look at what's special about our work. And we need to be able to hold that up, and we need to be able to value it, and we need to be able to demonstrate that we care about what we do in the way we seek to enhance student learning. And I think PCK is an opportunity to do that.